sorry, the
Right.
world of sort of applying for jobs is massive, and there's lots of different ways that you can look for jobs, lots of different places you may look for jobs now that perhaps 5, 10 years ago you'd never even have heard of, and different sort of methods, different systems on how jobs are assessed. So what we'll look at today is job searching in today's market. So what does the job market look like today, and how can you kind of overcome that? We'll look at some of the methods that you could use for job searching, so some of the different places you can look, some of the different ways, a little bit of a reminder into CVs. So for those of you that joined us last time, it'll be a recap. And if you didn't, it'll be, kind of a bit of an insight into how your CV will be assessed. How you can link your CV into things like cover letters, LinkedIn, and we'll have a little bit of a look at cover letters and at LinkedIn kind of in their own right. And then finishing off with your well-being during job searching. So that'll cover things like your mental well-being, the processes that you're going to go through. And also, as we had a question at the beginning, some of the kind of physical aspects when you are living with long-term conditions that you might need to consider. Excuse me. So hopefully it will give you a good oversight. But like we say, if there's anything you want us to cover, feel free just to jump in and let us know. So I've introduced myself, but for those who weren't here when we did so, I'm Tracy and I run CV Prime and HR Prime. So between the two organisations, we deal with job searching and CV writing for people and also HR advice for companies. So we can kind of give you advice over both sides of that. Eloise is also here with her camera on, and Elle works for me across the companies as well. So obviously she may well be answering questions on chat or joining in as well. Um, Topic today is job searching, applying, and LinkedIn. So, like I say, quite a general kind of overview. But obviously, if you've got any more specific questions, do ask them or get in touch with us afterwards, and we can obviously help with those. As we said, this session is recorded, but there is time at the end unrecorded for those of you who don't want to speak on camera. So, if you'd rather hold your questions, that's absolutely fine. Any questions at all before we speak, or any other comments? No, a couple of you have asked questions already, so I think hopefully you're quite happy. So a reminder for you that we're on the last one, or perhaps some interesting stats for those of you who weren't. So the average UK employee looks for a new job every 3.5 years at the moment. So as we said before, kind of gone are the days that people go into a job and it's a job for life and they stay there. The recruitment market is very, very fluid. And obviously some of the people that are job searching will be doing so because of things like redundancy or ill health or re-entering the job market, perhaps after a career break. But some of these people are people that are just perfectly happy in their jobs, that just every few years they change employer. So there is a lot of movement and a lot of activity in the market at the moment. And the average time last year on people from applying, so from the very first pen to paper on the application form to being offered a job, is about 28 days on average. So it just gives you a bit of an idea of what you may face as you're applying for jobs. And this one surprised me. Every single day in the UK, there are 9.8 million employed British people or people in Britain looking for roles. So these aren't the unemployed people, these are the people who are already in employment. So a really, really high figure, obviously, when you add in unemployed people as well. And since the pandemic, lots of kind of changes in priority as what people want for jobs. So these kind of questionnaires before the pandemic very much focused on money, um, status, all of the things that go with the jobs. Since the pandemic, there has been a massive shift in that, where people are now more interested in things like remote or hybrid working, reward and recognition, work-life balance, flexibility. So some of the areas that for a lot of yourselves who may have health conditions as well, a lot of these things are probably very, very important to you. But a few years ago, they may not have been important to other people. Whereas now, I think they're much more the norm. It's much more accepted that people can work from home, much more accepted that people want that flexibility. So hopefully, it may make your own job search easier in the sense that, what you're asking for, a lot of companies do now see as a really big benefit. So different methods that you can look for jobs. So recruitment agencies are obviously a very, very popular option. Recruitment agencies have always been there, and I think they always will be. They've got a real kind of purpose to help people find jobs. I would always say to get your CV out to recruitment agencies. There's no harm at all registering with them. Let them know what you're looking for, especially if you can find ones that specialise perhaps in areas that you're looking for. So if you're looking to go into perhaps teaching assistant roles, find an education agency. If you're looking for something HR, find an HR agency. There are a lot of them that specialise that are definitely worth applying for. These days, a lot of recruitment is done online. So you do get online agencies, like there's a page on Facebook, some of you may know, called the Work From Home Hub, that purely advertise work from home roles. There's other sort of Facebook groups or online groups that perhaps advertise for roles for women or, roles in particular sectors. So sometimes with recruitment agencies, it's a bit more dynamic than it may have been years ago, where it was more sort of a traditional building on the high street. But definitely do think about getting yourself registered in as many places as you can. Direct application to companies. So sometimes you'll see that a company have advertised a job, and that might be through social media, it might be through an advert in the window. So if a company is applied as advertised, obviously you can apply to them directly. And sometimes that's a really good way to go. Speculative applications kind of tie into that. So if there's a particular company that you would like to work for, there's nothing to stop you sending them a letter with your CV that says, I'm really interested in any roles you may have, and I've attached my CV for your consideration. And just apply not for a specific role, but for any roles that may come up in that company. LinkedIn we'll talk about a little bit later. I can't stress enough how much of a good job search tool LinkedIn is. At the moment, lots of jobs get advertised on LinkedIn that never even make it out into the wider job market, purely because they get filled so quickly on LinkedIn. So when you're looking for jobs, do look on LinkedIn, but more importantly, as we'll discuss later, make sure your profile is up to date before you do it, because LinkedIn will assess your suitability when you apply. So, make sure you've got everything on there so you're in with a really good shot when you apply. And then job sites and agencies. So these sometimes are things like online sites like Reed, Indeed, Monster Jobs, some of those ones that will cover lots of different companies for lots of different roles. Sometimes you can't register yourself so much as a job seeker on there. It's more about finding a role and applying for it. But it's definitely a really, really good place to look. And then sometimes you might see open days or recruitment drives. Certainly local councils are quite big on advertising sort of careers days. Sometimes they're in town halls or those kind of buildings, and lots of different companies will go along to advertise their vacancies. So if you can make it to any of those kind of events, they're a really, really good opportunity to meet lots of different employers on the same day and kind of give out your CV, put a face to a name. So a few different options there to look at. Some of them, like we say, are very traditional, and some of them are things that are kind of up and coming, like LinkedIn, that, 10 years ago, you'd never even thought of looking for a job on LinkedIn, and now it's probably the best place to do so. So when you are job searching, a couple of things to be aware of. So response to advert, this is probably the most common question that people say to me, and I would say the most common frustration amongst job seekers is you apply for a job, you put a lot of time into your application, sending off your application, and then you don't even get a response. The recruiter doesn't come back to you, or they come back and say they're unable to provide feedback. And sometimes as a job seeker, that can be really, really hard. Now, there isn't really a solution to that, unfortunately, apart from sort of offering or asking for feedback to be provided if you've done so. So when you're job searching here, we've got two different methods here. So response to advert would be if a company have advertised for a job and you apply for it. Now, in those cases, you're probably much more likely to get a response from the company because they've advertised a vacancy, they're managing their own vacancy, and sometimes you find that the processes are a little bit better in terms of the feedback or the kind of, the sort of outcome that you may get. When companies are managed speculatively, so if they're perhaps on an online site, they're managed through a recruitment agency, or you've just contacted them purely as a speculative application, and you don't know that company, very often they are the ones that you don't get any feedback from at all. So the only real advice we could give there would be to keep a note yourself, whether it's sort of a spreadsheet or a note in a book of what companies have you applied for, what date did you apply, and did you get any feedback or any kind of comeback from them? Because what you may find sometimes is those companies don't fill the job, and then next month they might advertise it again. So it's always a good idea, especially if you're applying for a lot of jobs, to have a note of whether you've applied for it or not. Should you submit another application, and just kind of keep on top of that yourself. A little bit of a reminder of how CVs are assessed, and this ties into what we're going to be talking about with LinkedIn. So, two possible methods of your application being assessed are hiring managers and recruiters. So, that is quite literally the person that's advertising the job, looking at your CV and making a decision as to whether to proceed, whether to shortlist you. Now, that method these days is much less common than the ATS method. Now, ATSs are the systems, so it stands for Applicant Tracking System, and they're the systems that will collate your data and very often shortlist people for roles. So the main thing to be aware of with this, and we discussed this sort of in the last session, so for those of you that weren't here at the last one, it might be worth watching the recording just to catch up on kind of the ATSs and what they do. The main thing to remember with ATSs is that they like very, very basic, very well formatted documentation. So ATSs can struggle massively with like the PDF Canva type CV layouts that are full of colours and logos and pictures. Very often the ATS systems can't read any of that information at all. The other big tip with ATSs is a lot of them will read from left to right across the page. So try and avoid columns, try and avoid tables, try and avoid anything at all that will throw out the system being able to read your CV. What those ATSs very often do is they will assess your CV against the job description or the requirements for the role. And the company will have their own benchmark that they're looking for, and they'll only proceed with applications, for example, that score 70%. So one of the biggest things that people ask me, and one of the biggest kind of frustrations that people find, is you might have a sentence in your CV. And let's say, for example, you've worked in an admin role and you've done admin for 20 years. You might have a sentence in your CV that says, I'm fully confident at managing all aspects of administration. Now, if a person read that and they see you've got a 20-year career history and they read that sentence, they're going to think to yourself, well, of course, this person can take minutes. Of course, they can book rooms. Of course, they can manage the logistics. But if the system is looking for the word taking minutes or booking rooms, managing logistics, it won't interpret it from that big sentence. So the biggest piece of advice I can give you with CVs, letters, LinkedIn, anything is just think about words. Get the words in and match the words that the job is looking for. If you've got a job description for a company that the whole way through it's talking about customer service, but your CV is talking about client satisfaction, it may not match the two and it shortlists you. So amend your CV and pick up the terminology that's in the job. So that really is the biggest piece of advice is just think about your words and think to yourself, would this make sense to somebody that doesn't know what I do? That overwriting sentence may make perfect sense to you, but to a system, it's going to miss all of the keywords that it's trying to pick up on. So they're the main ways that your CV will be assessed. As we said last time, 98% of large organisations use ATSs. They really are becoming more and more popular. Sometimes they're only used for data capture or for staff files, so they're not necessarily all used for recruitment, but going forward, it certainly is the way that the market is going. If a hiring manager looks at your CV, statistically last year they looked at it for between 6 and 8 seconds. So it's a very quick glance, a very quick yes or no, and then they move on to the next one purely because of the volume of applications. So making sure that everything's visual, making sure that you've mirrored it to the job. That really is the biggest piece of advice when you're job searching is mirror your CV or your documents to what the job wants. And hopefully, on either of those systems, you'll have enough in there to get yourselves through. Okay, so a few do's and don'ts just as a reminder. So do tailor your CV and do mirror the words and language. And it's so, so important in job searching that you can show when you apply why you're a good fit. Do tell the reader what you can do and check your spelling and grammar and make sure there's enough context around what you've done. Don't use jargon, logos, tables, and fancy font because it will absolutely confuse the systems. Don't elaborate your achievements to the extent that you're saying things that you can't substantiate. Strike that balance between being proud of your achievements but not over exaggerating them. Don't use exactly the same CV for every application because, like we say, even if you're applying for, say, an admin job in 3 or 4 different companies, they're all going to have something different that they're looking for. So do tailor it to pick up on what they want. Um, don't use underlines, bolds, and italics on the same word. Like we say, back to the systems, keep it very simple. Just pick one font type. And for every bit you put on there, ask yourself, so what? Why is that relevant? Why is that important? Is that going to add to my job search? If you've had perhaps a long time out of your career and you're going into a new role, but in the time that you've been out, you might have done some volunteering or some voluntary work, that might be really, really relevant. It might not be relevant to the job you're going into, but it certainly shows kind of a different level of experience and what you've done. Um, so that might be something that normally you might not add to your CV, but you might think actually is really important. You might have developed some skills through perhaps, looking after children or family skills, through a hobby or a club. So just think a little bit wider, kind of where your skills have come from and how that can add a different dimension to your application. So definitely worth doing before you apply. And then looking at linking your CV. Now, often I say to people, think about your brand, and people say, well, I haven't got a brand. I'm just a person. What do you mean, my brand? But what we're thinking here is make sure your CV reads consistently to your other documents. Obviously, a lot of people get CVs professionally written, and that's something obviously that I do um, for customers. But I always say to people, if you're going to get me to write your CV, for example, but then you're going to write your own cover letter and your own LinkedIn, make sure they all sound the same because that CV needs to sound like you. Regardless of whether you write it yourself or somebody writes it for you, it needs to sound like your document. You need to truly believe that when you go to an interview, that is your CV and you can kind of own it and talk about it. And then if you've got language and terminology on the CV, copy that across to your application form, copy it across to your LinkedIn profile and just make sure that the things that you're talking about on one document, you're also copying over to the other. So kind of building a whole brand of what your documents are and how they go together. Any questions at all so far? And then we're going to start to look at cover letters and LinkedIn in a bit more detail. No, you're quite happy. Okay. Cover letters. Some companies ask for cover letters and some don't. At the moment, they are probably less common, I would say, than they have been in the past. And I think that's purely because a lot more companies are using online recruitment methods that the cover letters aren't quite so important. But if you are asked for a cover letter or if you just want to write one, for your own kind of use, the cover letter really bridges the gap between the CV and the role. So where your CV is quite factual, there's not a lot of personality really in a CV. It's details, it's dates, it's perhaps some figures, some achievements. There's not much opportunity to talk about why you're a good fit for this role or how your experience matches this role. So your cover letter gives you a really good opportunity to kind of bridge that gap and show your suitability for particular elements of the role. So a few tips with cover letters, keep them to 1 to 2 pages. Generally speaking, I would say keep them to one, but I always say to people it's better to have 2 or 3 pages of relevant information than squashing it into one page and losing what you're trying to convey. So with a cover letter, 1 page is probably ideal, 2 pages is fine. Include your address. Really, really importantly, in the last session and CVs, I was telling you not to include your address. On your CV, you only need your town or your county and the first part of your postcode. On the cover letter, make sure it has your address on it. And at the bottom where you sign it off, you can put, enclosed CV and have your CV as an attachment to the letter. So they both go in together. So really on a cover letter, you're looking for about 3 to 4 paragraphs. So the first paragraph will be to introduce you. And that only needs to be something simple like, please find my CV closed in application for the position of administrator, which I saw on your website. Just something to introduce that you're applying, where you've seen the job, what the job title is. And again, that helps to show that you've tailored that cover letter for each role and that you're not just sending out a generic letter to every company. Paragraph 2 then is going to be why are you applying to the role? So you might want to start that paragraph off with something like, this role is very similar to my current position in that, and then describe it. Or, I'm really excited at the possibility of this role because it's an opportunity for me to work in a certain field that you're really interested in. So just something there to kind of introduce why are you applying? What can you bring to it? Kind of why you're a good candidate for the position. In the third paragraph, I would talk a little bit about the criteria. So that might be, I noticed on the job description that you're looking for somebody with experience in XYZ, and this is how I meet that. Or, it might be that you've researched their website, upon looking at your website, I can see that you're hoping to move into so and so in the future, and I feel I can really help this by. So just something that kind of links it. Talk about why you've applied for the position. So that could be professionally or personally. Personally, I like to have that last paragraph as something like, on a personal level, I would describe myself as, and this is your opportunity to talk about you. And especially where some of you may have been out of work for a long time, you might not have a lot of professional experience to talk about, but it's your personalities that are going to get you the job and the personalities that you want to come across. So tell them there, how reliable you are, how well do you work with other people. If you're really passionate about this role or passionate about the company, get that across there and really use that as an opportunity to talk about, your application and then finish off by thanking them for their time. So really that's all your cover letter needs to be. Probably 90% of it you can write in advance. You can write yourself a good template cover letter and then just amend the particular bits of the company as and when. Obviously, if they're looking for particular personal skills, add those in. as you apply, but the majority of that can be written as a template and just used throughout any application. Any questions at all on cover letters before we move on to LinkedIn? No. Okay. Personal statements kind of go along with cover letters, and sometimes people will say, a company have asked me for a cover letter, but they want 1,500 words. That really is a personal statement, not a cover letter. So many companies will specifically ask you for a personal statement or a supporting statement, they're sometimes called. If you apply for something like the civil service or the NHS, you can more or less guarantee 100% that you will be asked for a personal statement. And they'll give you a word count on those. Normally it's 1,500 words or 3,500 characters, but they will tell you in advance what the word count is. On a personal statement, rather than it being sort of a general cover letter, which is just talking about you, and kind of introducing yourself and your role, a personal statement will ask you to evidence suitability against core criteria. So sometimes it will give you 4 or 5 headings and it will say, produce a 1,500 word document that evidences your suitability against this criteria. And it might be things like customer service, it might be things like admin skills, training and development, but they'll give you the headings that they want you to talk about. So what you need to do here, and the thing that's really, really important with personal statements, is to use real examples. So if you were to get a cover letter that says, give us 1,500 words and they've given you 4 criteria to talk about, I would say allow yourself sort of 100 words for your introduction and your thank yous at the end, and then break down the remaining 1,400 words. So if you're breaking that down over 4 questions, you've only got about 350 words per question. So it's not a massive answer, but try not to make them too hypothetical. So if, for example, one of the criteria was customer service, it would be very easy to write a whole paragraph about, when I'm dealing with customers, I would do this and I would do that, but you need to try and make it real. So I always say to people, start off with a sentence that says, customer service is one of the most important elements of any role, but particularly in this role where I will be doing X, Y, Z, so bring it back to the role. And then I would say, an example of a time that I've delivered outstanding service is, and then give them an example of a time that you've really done it. So you're not just telling them what you would do, but you're showing them what you have done. Getting that balance into 350 words, I would say, can be quite tricky. It sounds like a lot of words, but when you start writing, it really isn't. So try and follow that same kind of format for each of the questions. So you've got a balance between kind of the theory and the hypothetical to the actual practical skills, and try and sort of mirror that across every answer. The most important thing with personal statements is stick to the word count. The systems that they scan them in will literally cut off your document at 1,500 words or 3,500 characters or whatever the limit is. So if you carried on talking beyond it, it will just cut off the answer when you get to it. Now, if the end of your statement is only something minor, like, thank you for your time, that's probably not going to be critical. But if it cuts you off in the middle of a really important sentence, that could be quite problematic in terms of your answers. And the other thing is, if you're applying for something like an admin role or a role where you're showing your attention to detail, this is a really good example of attention to detail. And if you've ignored the word count or you've gone over it, it can actually be counterproductive in your application. So do check your word count. As with anything else, check your spelling and grammar. You can use things like the read aloud function on Word, get somebody else to read through it, go to sleep and read it again the next day. So really, really go through it and check your spelling and grammar. And with personal statements, check how the document should be titled. Now, that sounds really obvious, but very often on a personal statement, they will tell you how they want it to save. So, for example, civil service ones may say, please save this document as your name, the job title, and the date, or your initials, the job title, and the month. So just look at the format that they're asking you to submit it, because if they run that through an ATS, they will be relying on the ATS system to pick that up as being a personal statement. And the only way it will do that is by the format that it's been saved as. So it's really important, if they tell you how to save it, just follow their instructions to the letter. So that's personal statements for you. With personal statements, differently to the cover letter, like I say, I would recommend if you want a cover letter, if you're going for roles that have them, it is something you can have and you can just tweak and reuse. With a personal statement, I wouldn't write a personal statement until you're applying for a job that needs one, because they're all so different in terms of what they will ask for, what they want the layout to be, what they want you to cover. Very often it's much easier to write that from scratch than to just try and tweak a current document. So this is the exception to being prepared. You know, this is the one that I would produce at the time once you know what they're after. Okay. And then LinkedIn. So we'll have a little bit of a look at LinkedIn, a bit of a chat around what LinkedIn does. Excuse me. As we did last time, I will send out some guides after the session, and one of those is a LinkedIn guide. So you'll also be able to read on there. Just some stats around LinkedIn to give you a little bit of an idea of kind of its scope and what it does. So LinkedIn has around about 930 million users, over 34 million in the UK alone. Okay, it's a really good question. We just had a question on the chat, so we just go back to cover letters. So if you're applying by email or online form, can you still write it and attach it as a separate document? The answer to that generally is yes. If you're applying by email, absolutely 100% yes, because you'll just attach it as a separate file at the top. What you might find on some ATSs is they will only have space to physically upload one document. So if it says, for example, please upload any supporting documents, however, this is restricted to one file, what you might want to do is put your cover letter on page of your CV and then upload one document, the cover letter and CV together. So yeah, it's definitely possible to do it, but just follow their instructions as to whether there's any limits on size or anything. LinkedIn, 83% of jobs that are posted on LinkedIn get a qualified candidate in 23 hours. So as we say, I really, really can't stress enough how much of an absolutely brilliant job search tool LinkedIn is. There's 30 million companies registered on LinkedIn, and at any one time, 20 million open jobs. Obviously, it's across the world, not just in the UK. 87% of recruiters use LinkedIn for recruitment. And this is the stat that absolutely surprises me. 77 job applications are made every second, over 4,500 a minute, and over 277,000 an hour. So every single day on LinkedIn, there's over 6.5 million applications being made. I mean, it's an absolutely amazing figure. And when I read these, I've double checked them about 100 times. And, you know, it's such a massive number of people that are applying on there. The most important thing with LinkedIn, and the most important thing to take out of today, is LinkedIn has its own ATS. So if you apply for a job on LinkedIn, it will search your CV and your documents and your profile in exactly the same way as the ATS systems do, where it will look for words. So with LinkedIn, sorry, let me just move on. Tips for your profile. So have a good, clear cover photo. Make it professional, but be friendly. You know, so generally speaking, LinkedIn would ask for a headshot, but I think as long as it's a professional, nice photo, you know, for the average sort of person, that's absolutely fine. On LinkedIn, you can also create a banner. So I don't know how familiar you are with LinkedIn, but your banner is a bit along the top that's additional to your cover photo that you can put anything you want to into. So some people have a banner with perhaps their job title and their phone number on, or where we've got a company, my banner has got the company links on. So you can have a banner. You can create them quite easily for free in things like Canva or other documents. If you're stuck, let me know and we can talk you through how to create a banner, or, you know, or help you create one quite easily. But it just adds, when somebody clicks on your profile on LinkedIn, it just adds that kind of that extra dimension, you know, that extra bit of information. Consider opening your profile to recruiters. So there is a box on LinkedIn that you can tick, and it literally says open to recruiters, and you tick yes or no. If you open your profile up to recruiters, it means anybody on LinkedIn that has a recruiter license can view your profile and contact you about vacancies. Sometimes people worry about this, that kind of your current company might know that you've done it, or your current, you know, current colleagues. The only people that we know you've done this is people with a recruiter license. So if you're not working at the moment, or, you know, you're using LinkedIn quite sort of as and when, it's very unlikely that any of your contacts will know that you've opened this. But obviously you do just need to be aware that it's not impossible. But it does mean that recruiters can contact you directly on there. You can add the open to work green banner. So some of you might have seen that on there, and it's literally a banner that goes around your profile picture and says open to work. So again, it just gives another tool for recruiters to find you and to contact you. And then there's certain sections on LinkedIn that you'll need to fill in. So about me is a really important section on there. And this is your chance, a little bit like the personal profile that we talked about on the CV. So this is your chance to tell them anything particular that you want them to know. So it might be you've got lots of experience in a certain field. It might be that you're keen to re-enter a career and this is the kind of thing that you're looking for. So it only needs to be probably about 5 or 6 lines. It doesn't need to be massive. There is a word limit on that of 2,500 words. So if you're writing too much, it will stop you. But just get some information in there to introduce yourself. Contact details obviously are really important, and it's up to you whether you want to put your email, your phone number. You get the choice of making them visible to public or not. But do have something on there so people can sort of get hold of you if they need to. There's a career history or a job history section on LinkedIn. What I would say on that is have a little bit of detail, exactly like you would on a CV. So a little bit of detail under each role. So you're hitting some of the words that you might need for the word searches. Um, with LinkedIn, you can make it first person. So whereas your CV is generally written in third person, LinkedIn, you can talk about I have done or in this job I did, make it a bit more personal. Qualifications obviously speak for themselves. Skills is the most important section on LinkedIn, and I really can't stress how important this section is. The skills section will let you have either 50 or 100 skills, depending what version of LinkedIn you're running. They're gradually updating them to 100. And they are literally standalone words. So a little bit like the skills section on your CV. If you're working in admin, for example, some of your skills may be things like document production, working to deadlines, all of those kind of things. The good thing with LinkedIn is once you type in one skill, it will suggest other skills that you may also want to add. So you don't literally need to think of 50 or 100 words. It will prompt you and it will help you to do it. But this is the section that is the highest weighted section on the LinkedIn ATS. So if you were to apply for a job on LinkedIn and your skills section is completely blank, you're not going to shortlist for that job because it won't be able to find the skills that it's looking for. So a combination of all of these sections is important, but the skills section honestly is absolutely vital. So just get that up to date before you start applying for jobs. On LinkedIn, you can ask for recommendations. So if you've perhaps worked with people in the past, or you can just give somebody a recommendation. So anybody can go on and give a recommendation to anybody, whether you want to write a bit like a reference, really. You could either write a few words or you could just tick a box and rate them. But it's a really good idea if you've got people that you've worked with in the past to ask for recommendations on there. And then the other big tip on LinkedIn is to be active. Now, very often people really struggle with this and say, well, I don't like to use LinkedIn or I don't really know what I'm doing. When you go onto LinkedIn, you can like different groups. So for some of you who use other social media channels, you might be sort of familiar with this. But you could, for example, like people, it could be famous people, it could be influencers, it could be celebrities, it might be businesses, but go on and like some different groups. Where people post things, even if it's something that you think is interesting, you can like people's posts. So a lot of being active, if you're not comfortable to, doesn't necessarily have to be you creating your own posts and, writing things that you might not feel comfortable to do so. It could just be liking other people's posts or, kind of going through and just looking at things, viewing things. So just anything that keeps you active. What you don't want is for your account to be completely dormant and then a recruiter contacts you about a job and it shows as an account that isn't looked at or isn't an active account. So it's really important to try and do that if you can. The other thing with LinkedIn before we move on to wellbeing is there is a jobs tab on LinkedIn. It's generally along the top of the page, but you can click on that and you can filter that to different areas. So you can filter it by postcode, you can filter by location, whether you want to be remote or on site. You can filter by working hours. And if you type in that, it will bring up all of the jobs that match that criteria. And then you can literally just click on them and apply, and it will take the application from your profile. So very often you don't even need to update a CV or anything. It will just take your initial application from your LinkedIn page. So if your page is up to date, it's a really good way to do that. So that's sort of LinkedIn covered. Any questions at all on anything to do with LinkedIn before we move on?
Yes, I have a question. So if you've had or got a long-term health condition,
Yeah.
but you're kind of looking for an employer that is disability confident and that they're quite happy to employ somebody with that kind of status,
Yep.
can LinkedIn reflect that?
You will find that a lot of companies on LinkedIn will advertise that they are disability confident. So what you might want to do is if you see a job advertised on there, have a look at that company's page on LinkedIn because it'll always tell you when you see the job who the recruiter is and who the company is. So there's nothing to stop you having a look on the page. and seeing how they advertise themselves, how they talk about things like disability confidence. It won't be a search tool in itself. So you wouldn't be able to only search for disability confident employers, for example, but you would know who the employer is. So through a combination of sort of LinkedIn and the website, you would be able to get a feel for that.
Okay, thank you. And would you advise kind of showing the fact that you're kind of looking for that kind of employer?
That's a really hard question, to be honest. And I think that's probably the question that most of yourselves and most people in general will sort of
Yeah.
struggle with. I would always say to people, really, it depends what you're looking for. If the nature of your disability means, for example, you need a home-based role,
Yeah.
this is a home-based role being advertised anyway,
Yeah.
then there's probably nothing to be added by telling them at this stage. You know, it may be you want to go through the interview, go a bit further through the process, get them to know you before you ask for
Yeah.
the adjustments, because in that case, it wouldn't be a massive adjustment and it's probably not going to have a big impact on them.
Okay.
Um, if it was something, for example, where it's advertised as an on-site role, but you need it to be home-based and there's no flexibility in that, then I
Okay.
would probably say if it's an absolute deal breaker, you may as well have that conversation with them up front. Because if
Right.
they were to say, you know, there's no flexibility at all, it has to be here or it has to be this, that, and the other, you're probably wasting your time proceeding if it's going to stop you being able to proceed.
Right. Okay.
So
Thank
I think it sort of comes down to how much of a deal breaker it is, I suppose, and how important it is that they adjust it. Generally speaking, I would say, you know, obviously don't lie at all. And it's nothing at all that you should have to you know, to not talk about and not sort of be proud of. But I think it's probably more appropriate to come out later on in the process rather than at the initial inquiry.
Oh, right. Okay. I kind of wasn't sure whether you need to kind of be up from the start or whether you can kind of disclose that later on. I'm not really sure, you see.
I think it's fine to disclose it later on as long as you don't lie. I mean, if they were to ask a question that says, do you need any adjustments or do you have any disabilities? And you said no, that may be a problem later on. But if the question isn't asked and you don't need to say it, then I don't think there's anything to say that you should speak up before you're comfortable to.
Okay. Thank you.
Catherine, you got your hand up.
Sorry, hi. Sorry, I joined late. I'm so sorry. My name is Kat and I'm from Astrid. Do you know what? I'm learning so much today. It's amazing. Um, there is no there's no sort of set way when you're looking at disclosure, so you don't have to disclose. There is no
Yeah.
legal obligation to disclose. So one, it depends on what you feel comfortable with, and it's up to each individual. For me personally, I would never disclosed during the job application process, and then depending on the interview and the questions asked, I may well disclose, but it's up to what you feel comfortable with, you know, as an individual. We do have actually we released to Astrid last week information around disclosure and discrimination, so a guide for people with long-term health conditions, which just covers the Equality Act and a bit about disclosure. So if it's okay, I'll just put that in the chat, the link to that, and then you can just download that and then have a look.
Excellent. Thanks, Kat. Okay, so I just got a message in chat. Let me just read that before we move on. Okay, it's fine. Next slide we're going to look at is well-being during job searching. So this is kind of the last slide, and then we'll stop the recording so we can ask any questions if you want to talk off camera. I think the biggest advice we can say during job searching for anybody, not just for this session, you know, this is something I emphasize in all the sessions I run, is think about your own mental health and well-being. Job searching is difficult. You know, there's no two ways about that. It's a tough market. Um, Even just the process and kind of the mental load of applying for jobs, researching jobs, you know, potentially rejections and not being answered when you do apply for jobs, you know, it can all really take a toll on you. And I think it's really important to identify any support that you might need. Um, Even simple things like asking your family and friends to help with your proofreading or asking somebody to check over your application. Sometimes, as we talked about last time, when you're applying, it might be you're trying to analyze what your strengths and weaknesses are, and that can be really hard to do yourself. So it might just be saying to a friend or a family member, you know, what do you think are my strengths, or what would you say is my biggest weakness? And just kind of draw people in because the people around you will be happy to help you. And the help doesn't need to be massively time consuming, it doesn't need to be massively onerous. But just the little things can just take that little bit of weight off of you. Adopt a strategy to deal with rejections and feedback. Now, that always sounds much scarier and much more formal than it needs to be. I would always advise, as I said earlier, keep a note of what jobs you apply for. You know, just even a note of what company have you applied for, what was the job, And did you get feedback from them? You know, sometimes you might not get anything from them at all. You literally don't get any response at all. And that sometimes can be even harder than negative feedback. But I think put yourself in a position where you are asking companies for feedback on your application, because it can only help you to move forward. A lot of the time, the feedback might not be any more than, you know, it come down to two candidates and we had to pick one. You know, it was a really good interview. Well done, but we didn't appoint you. And sometimes that can be really hard because there's nothing to kind of learn from that, is there, or to move forward with. But I think don't be afraid to ask for feedback, and kind of more or less, you know, every rejection that you get or every bit of feedback you get is a step closer to finding a job. You know, it is really difficult at the time and it can be really hard, but look at it as, you know, keep going. Don't give up at that first rejection. You know, it's just one step in the journey to finding a role. And then reaching out to your connections and networks. So like we say, if you're using LinkedIn, ask for some recommendations. Even just something like putting a message out, which you might see a lot on LinkedIn, you know, I'm looking for a new role. If anybody hears of anything, please let me know. Can be enough that it lets people know that you're looking. And it only takes one person to see something or to speak to somebody, and then they remember, oh, actually, so-and-so's looking for that. You know, these days there's so much around networking and using your connections. Don't kind of feel that you're on your own, I suppose, is the message in job searching. Like we say, reach out for what you need, get the help that you need, and sort of be realistic about how long it might take and the process that you need to go through as well.